Okay, this is a Sunday afternoon for me here where I am. Wanted to take this time out just to, first of all, tell everybody thank you for subscribing so far. In the last month alone, we've had nearly 1,000 subscribers, so I'm very grateful to you. No doubt the majority of the reason for this has been the Woman King film and the connection it has to the Dahomey Kingdom documentary, which we have on the channel. So, first of all, I want to just say a big welcome to all of you who've just joined who are first of all subscribing to the channel for the first time and are seeing the work that we're putting out. I'm very grateful. I just wanted to do this quick video just to talk about a few things. I haven't seen the film yet, so I just thought let me start off by just giving a little bit of background information, also just to lay the foundation for myself and for anybody who hasn't seen the film. So don't forget also, before we go any further, I do need to get you guys to start subscribing more, start sharing it, start liking it as much as possible. Because, you know, we're trying to grow the channel. It's not, to be honest with you, YouTube is not really, YouTube, the idea of putting the documentaries on YouTube was mainly to have somewhere to showcase the documentaries, because mainstream companies weren't really trying to invest in us or also stream or also publish them on their channels. So it just made it very difficult. So please subscribe, please share, please make comments, and it'll give us the opportunity to do more. Couple things also, what's coming up for us? I'm going off to shoot a documentary in Egypt. It's been a long time coming. For those of you who follow the AEA films on Instagram, you'll see that we've been going out to Egypt, doing some legwork, trying to get things working, get things moving. We got some investment last year, but due to the pandemic, we had to keep pushing things back. Documentary is going to be featuring myself as usual, but also featuring hopefully Dr. Obadile Campbell of the University of Ghana. If you don't know about the guy, Google him. He's a very interesting character. So what I wanted to talk to you guys today was what I wanted to talk about today was the difference between slavery in West Africa and slavery in the Americas. So I say West Africa specifically because when we talk about the so-called transatlantic slave trade, we're talking about the region of West Africa largely, and what would be called Central Africa. So if you look at your map, Angola is kind of Southern Africa, but it's kind of central. You've got Congo, which is Central Africa, the two Congos, the Congo River Basin, that's Congo Brazzaville, Congo Kinshasa, or DRC, all the way Central African Republic, Cameroon, and then all that western region of West Africa, really all the way up to just the southern part of Morocco, southern part of Tunisia. So that region is huge. And if you ever see one of those maps where they like to explain how big Africa is, and then they have Russia in there, which is essentially the largest country. They put China in there. They put Western Europe in there. They put United States. That's all those places could fit in America. So that region of Western Africa is essentially a continent in itself, probably bigger than all those countries. So bigger than Russia, probably bigger in terms of landmass, bigger than Russia, maybe bigger than bigger than the United States, maybe bigger than Russia, bigger than China, so on. So that region is humongous. So I think it's very important to understand a couple of things as well. In West Africa, you see, there was no concept of blackness until it became important. You see, when you live on a continent where you walk around everywhere, you talk to people, you travel to a faraway land, maybe you can travel 6 months. If you read the Leo Africanus, you read the stuff that he wrote. Is it Leo Africanus? Is him or somebody else? I think it's Leo Africanus who used to write that, you know, it could take you 6 months to travel from one part of the Mali Empire to the other. Now, Mali Empire, of course, starts near Senegal and goes all the way to Central Africa. So he said it could take 6 months to travel. This is, of course, back in the day, on camel, horseback, whatever. So that shows you how big the place was. So even with these places, there was no concept of blackness, because you go that far, 6 months to travel, it's just still black people, you know? So the idea of blackness wasn't a thing. It's just these people, these are the Lembe people, these are the Kanuri people, these are whatever. There's just different groups of people, different nationalities, if you will. So basically what happened was, you had influences from different parts of the world. If you watch the documentary that we put out, which is the documentary on Mali, Jenne and the Dogon, and then the rise of Islam in Mali, those two documentaries, what you see is you start off with essentially the Ouagadougou Empire, which really covers most of the northern part of Western Africa. Ouagadougou Empire eventually gets taken over by the Mali Empire, and then eventually Songhai. So all these places are really covered the northern part going towards North Africa. I should have really pulled up a map. Maybe that would have made life easier, but maybe next time. So the southern part, the more greener parts, the parts like where Ghana is, where most of Nigeria is today, where Togo, Benin, Senegal, all these places, that lower part is relatively green. And because it's relatively green, the terrain is different, and so you have different types of people. In the north, you have more nomadic people, Tuaregs, and in the south, you have less, this is where you get the Gbe languages, the Fon people, the Yoruba, the more drum-influenced people. You can even see it in the music. If you listen to the music from Mali, that part of the world, Chad, Niger, it's a lot more, philosophical. You listen to even their musical instruments, the ngoni, which is essentially like a little banjo, the kora, which is the guitar. Their music is more philosophical. Whereas you go to the south, and this is really where you have the essence of, hip hop, R&B, reggae, because it's the drums. You do music that you listen to in the southern parts of Western Africa. That really is, and this is why I'm saying it's very important when we're talking about West Africa to understand the differences, not only in culture, but also in just the way people's mentality, the different mentalities that people have. So let me get back to my point. So these different people have different influences. Obviously, in the north, these people are the northern part is influenced by Islam, even till today, and that really came about in the Middle Ages. What happened was after the period they called the Hijra, which is the period when the Prophet Muhammad passed away. You had essentially a jihad that goes all the way from Mecca or into the northern part of Africa, and they really go over conquering loads of different regions. Excuse me. They go over and conquer loads of different regions. And as they conquer those different regions, first of all, can you guys hear me? Please, just if anybody's watching, give me a 1 if you can hear me. I'm not sure if you can actually hear me. Give me a 1 or 2 if you can't hear. 1 if you can hear, 2 if you can't hear. I guess not. Okay, let's see. Those of you who are in the chat, please give me a 1. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so let me get back to my point. So essentially, what you have happening is in the southern part, you have people who are influenced largely by the water. And shout out to Bobby E. Wright, Mr. C, I think Mr. CEAB, Galactic Soul, Messi Carter, Global Citizen. Thank you very much for joining in. Some of you I recognize Queen Marion. Thank you so much. So just in case you're confused, I'm just discussing the differences between slavery, but we haven't got there yet. We're still discussing the differences within West Africa alone. I'm not even dealing with East Africa. So we're looking at West Africa. The north is influenced by the Hijra. So the Hijra is the period after Prophet Muhammad passes away, and then there's all sorts of chaos about who's going to succeed him. Eventually leads to wars, and they go and conquer the northern part. This is why the Berber people of like Morocco and places like that, you could see that them culturally, they're not fully like the Islamic people in the so-called Middle East. They think very differently. But then as you go into the more so quote-unquote Arabic conquered places, which were later conquered by the Turks, they become more Islamic. But I digress. So these people eventually come into northern parts of West Africa, so play Old Mali, and they find their way in. And if you watch the documentary that I have on Jenne and the Dogon, and also the rise of Islam in Mali, you can see the way that they came in. They never came in as conquerors. They just couldn't. The Mali, the Songhai, those empires were way too powerful for them to try and do anything silly. So they came in really piecemeal. And they did come in with a form of slavery. But it's not a slavery which is different to what was being practiced around the world. It is this form of indentured servitude. See, and I think this is a definition that comes in very handy. Indentured servitude is not the same as chattel slavery. Indentured servitude essentially is, in a time when prisons didn't exist, in a time when it was literally corporal punishment or some type of repatriation, not repatriation, some type of reparation. There was no way you could say to people that we're going to degrade you as a human being. We're just basically going to say that we're going to take control of your life. You're going to work with us for a period, and then you will go. And this happened in the Eastern slave trade, but we're not dealing with that. So that was happening in the North. And of course, the Portuguese came and did deals with the Arabs, and these Arabs eventually started shipping people across the Sahara to Eastern Africa and then far away to Persia. And the southern part, of course, it existed there too. If you read the accounts back in, I think, of Onuora Abuah, the so-called slave called Gustavus Vasa, and I'll link all these titles and things that I'm mentioning in the description later. But Gustavus Vasa, Onuora Abuah, is an enslaved man who was taken from what is now Igbo land in Nigeria and enslaved. He was first taken to Ghana, and if you read his accounts, this is back in the 1700s. He's writing about him going to Ghana as an enslaved person, but it was never really. It's more like this is, of course, this is at the time of the so-called transatlantic slave trade, but he gets taken to Ghana, or what is now called Ghana, and he doesn't feel the sense of degrading until he gets on the ships and then goes to the Caribbean and then eventually goes to Britain. He doesn't see that kind of. He's not degraded as a human being. He's just really just a captive. Okay. It's not a good thing, but it's very important when you understand the differences, which we'll come to later. So the Portuguese are really dealing with the Arabs. Then the Portuguese, and of course we're talking about the time Ferdinand of Castile. They get given permission by the head of the Roman Catholic Church to indenture to enslave people, all so-called infidels, because essentially they've found all this land in the Caribbean, which to them they can inhabit and control, and eventually be able to make money out of with the sugar and all the different crops that they were growing. So they had first tried their own people. They tried their own people. They tried, and 1492 is a very important year. It's the year Christopher Columbus sets off to the New World, but it's also the last, literally the end of the Moorish reign, the final end of the Moorish reign of Andalusia, the Iberian Peninsula, that part of Europe. The Moors, if you don't know, are people who were largely African people, largely Islamic influenced, but largely from West Africa, the black people that conquered Europe, so to speak. So when they die off as leaders in that part of the world, some of them are also taken to the Caribbean. And if you read, is it Christianity Before? I forget the book. I'll link the book later. It's escaped my mind. But there are a few accounts about this. And of course, Christopher Columbus goes to the New World, sees all this land. They first use natives of the place, and it doesn't quite work out. In fact, if you go to a place like the Dominican Republic / Haiti, there are very few indigenous people in that place, because these people were later repopulated by enslaved Africans who were brought over. Because they wiped these people out. They weren't, for lack of a better word, they weren't built to work the land as African people are built to work the land. Okay? So the Arabs are dealing, so we're still talking about the early part, 1500s, 1600s. They're building, establishing things. They're now starting to move away from the sort of quote unquote Arab slave trade. And of course, you start to see a decline in what was later called the Songhai Empire, which was the last great empire that we see in Africa. The Songhai Empire, as it declines, we start to see it basically declines by the Moroccans. The Moroccans invade and really just decimate the culture. So Timbuktu and all these places, their books, the value of their books no longer is seen by the Moroccans. They take things. They even take some of the great scholars like Ahmed Baba, who of course we discussed in documentary Rise of Islam in Mali. They take these people and exile them over to Morocco. So really that part of Western Africa was now open. It was now open. So not only Islam could come in, but people who were explorers looking to see the ancient city of Timbuktu, they were now starting to come. So now we get to a place where the Portuguese see that, okay, there's some leeway there, but the structure that we had is no longer there. The roots are still there, but they're not as powerful. Let's start moving along the western coast of Africa. So they go around, start building forts at Elmina, Cape Coast Castle. They start going right along the coast and building these small forts, even one that we visit in my documentary Voodoo in Togo, which is also on the channel. These small establishments. Now, some of them are big forts, and some of them they just see locals. And again, it's very important to understand that locals were involved in this trade, but they were not involved as a state policy per se. You had these kingdoms that were more in the hinterland, and these were people on the periphery who were essentially making contact with the Europeans. Like when you watch all those old, like North by Northwest, those old movies about European colonialists, they'll go to this island like Tahiti, for example, and the people will rush out to meet them on their canoes, and then they'll interact with them. That's not to say that those are the people that represent the entire region, but those are the people that live on the coast. So some of them, they will learn Portuguese, they will learn French, and start dealing with these Europeans. And so what quickly happened was they started to realize that these Europeans have these things that we're not used to seeing. Okay, remember, these are, in a way, you could say some of them are outcasts of society or outcasts of the greater kingdoms. So these people start to say, okay, look, I like those little trinkets. We'll do this. What do you need for it? They say, look, we need people. Now, this was happening at a smaller level until we get to the rest of the Europeans, when they start to see that the trade is working. So the Norwegians, the Danes, the people from the Dutch people, they start to get into the trade, but don't have the power of naval intelligence and expertise. They do now, but at the time weren't that prominent. But they were doing the same sort of trade, establishing their own little places in Southern America by using enslaved African people, doing deals with some African people, some African kingdoms, until Elizabeth I. And I want to just say this, the death of Queen Elizabeth II in the UK was a very mourned event. And, you know, I'm sensitive to the loss of life. But certainly the woman she's named after, Queen Elizabeth I, is really in the words of John Henry Clark, when she came into the slave trade, so-called slave trade, she made it a business. She made it a business. It became structured with insurance companies, with stock exchange. They started really speculating on human lives because they saw how lucrative it was. You take these people, handful of them, and by the way, it's not as if they were just going and grabbing sailors because the business was so lucrative, right? So they were going and doing this thing they called press ganging, which is essentially just going and grabbing people off the streets, pulling them out of the pubs, throwing them on the ship and say, you're going to work the ship. And of course, these voyages were brutal. People died, people suffered. So this is what they were doing. But before she even started that, she sent her ship, Jesus, the good ship Jesus, with I think it was Captain Hawkins was the captain of the ship, sent him over. They started doing their reconnaissance and they started to see that, yes, this is big business. So when they came in, it went to another level. And they literally kicked the Portuguese off the coast of West Africa. So all those Elmina, they called the mine, which is I think it's a Portuguese translation, Elmina, all these ports that are along the West African coastline, they kicked the Portuguese off. The Portuguese ended up having to run to Southern Africa, right? So they kicked them off. And now they turned it into a business. So essentially they had much of the control of the West African side. Now the Woman King film, again, I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, it takes place in the early part of the 19th century, so around 1830s, under King Gezo. And this is just from what I remember from when King Gezo was reigning. It was around that period. And King Gezo's father was a guy called King Agunglu, okay? And they were from the Dahomey Kingdom. Now, the Dahomey Kingdom really came about. If you watch the documentary we made called Dahomey and Bodun, the Dahomey Kingdom Part 1, you will understand that these people essentially were people who had to form themselves as a result of being enslaved. So when the British come in, right, I'm just taking it back. I'm just going back 1 second, just to explain the origin of the Fon people and the origin of the Dahomey Kingdom. So the British come along the West African coastline. They start to see the Ashanti. And these are people who have superior weapons. You know, they have the cannons, they have the muskets, which is essentially what defeated Mali and those greater kingdoms that were further north in West Africa. They have these superior war instruments. So they go and start doing deals. Now, again, we have to understand this is essentially a continent. West Africa is a sub-region, but it's essentially a continent, right? If you want to look at it in terms of size and landmass. So people warred with each other. People had battles. People were fighting each other. Neighbors were fighting each other. It's no different to if you look at the First World War. First World War essentially was a war fought between cousins. You had King of England, his cousin, the Tsar of Russia. They were both fighting their cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the king of Prussia, which later became Germany. So this is something that even these people who are fighting relatives, let alone people fighting different kingdoms next to them for control. And even the concept of the Yoruba people, which is another thing that people like to try and discuss, especially being in Nigeria. The concept of Yoruba people is not even real. They're Yoruba speaking people. If you go back 100, 150 years ago, you had the Oyo, you had Ife, you had different groups who spoke the same language. Just like if you watch my documentary on Kano, we discussed the Hausa. The Hausa essentially were different city-states who never ever came together as one, even though they had similar language. Culturally, they were quite different too, but they spoke the same language. So the point I'm making is people next to each other always fought, even if they had similarities. It's no different to having children, two brothers fighting each other all the time. Okay? So the question always goes back to chattel slavery versus indentured servitude. A few minutes ago, I explained to you the difference. The slavery that existed in the system came about as a byproduct of these battles, of these little beefs that people had within each other, amongst each other. You had a lack of, well, there were no prisons. People didn't operate a prison system. If you read Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, there is a battle between there's a conflict that happens between two neighboring people of the same so-called tribe, but just two different villages. And rather than go to war, they go and negotiate. And I think what had happened was an innocent girl was killed. So the deal was, okay, you have to give us a girl back, right? It's an exchange, a life for a life. Now that girl's life is not to say that she was going to be working in the cotton fields or anything. She was just essentially brought into the family of the person who negotiated, who was Okonkwo, right? And this is very similar to what was happening. Prisoners of war were taken, and they won't be reduced to 3/5 of a human being. Absolutely not. That wasn't what was happening. They were being brought in and used as workers sometimes. Sometimes they could marry into the family. Sometimes they could be adopted into the family too. In fact, if you go throughout history, all around the world, this form of indentured servitude happens all over the world. I think General Ganges in India is a common example. You know, these things tended to happen. Even the story, if you look, even though it's fictional, look at the story of Ben-Hur. You have a man who's essentially taken as an enslaved person, a prince, Palestinian prince, adopted by a Roman general, and he rises up the ranks. Okay, becomes a Roman citizen. So these are things that happen in the ancient world. There's nothing new about that. And to think that somehow chattel slavery and indentured servitude are similar, it's just completely different. Okay. So Africans were not looking at each other as, oh, this is my black brother, this is my black brother, because everybody was black. You were warring other black people. Okay. And so because of that, you are when you take somebody as a prisoner, you use them for whatever you need to use them for. Sometimes it's harsh, but it is not degrading in the sense of you are 3/5 of a human being. I think that's a very important point. So the British are dealing with the Oyo. They arrive on the coast, western part of what is now Nigeria, and they're dealing with the Oyo, they're dealing with other different groups. They go all the way as far as Calabar. They deal with different groups. Those groups, some of them control the entire area and find their weakest and say, okay, let's take our weakest and let's use our weakest as the enslaved. But the demand becomes greater because the British have, at one point, I think it was a quarter of the world was under their control. So they have demand everywhere. They need people. They need as many, the ships couldn't move fast enough. And because they understood that they had superior weapons and weren't necessarily confident enough to go into the land and get the people themselves, they said, okay, let's just keep upping the stakes. Let's give these guys on the coast as much as they need. You know, if they need to buy a box of gold, if they need wine, whatever it is they need that they're not used to seeing, let's give it to them. And then they go into the coastline. You read Richard Burton, not the actor, Richard Burton's books. Richard Burton was a British, what do you call him, a diplomat, I guess, who went to the Dahomey Kingdom, went to meet the Dahomey King. I think it was Agungulu. I think King Agungulu. I forget. It's whilst I read that book. But Richard Burton talks about how he drove, and even the way he's writing about African people, it's it just seems like there's no respect. And this is when you can start to see history changing, because even history, at one point, even at the start of the enslavement period, it was a racial thing, no question. They couldn't do it with the poor white people. They couldn't do it with the poor people of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. They couldn't do it with the natives of the Caribbean, so-called Caribbean. So they took the blacks. So it wasn't really a racial thing. It was just who are the best people we could get to do the job that will survive. But at this point, as the British come in, it starts to really become a degrading thing. It starts to really become more and more like we are looking at you people as less than human beings. And I think it's John Henrik Clarke talks about the Aryan model of history versus the ancient model of history. He's not the only one who talks about it. I think Shekhar Diop talks about it. The Aryan model of history, which is the new Aryan in the sense of white racial point of view of history, versus the ancient model. And you start to see books being changed. Okay, books and description of people in history start to become whitewashed. So you start to see that this happens around the late 1700s, going into the 1800s, as the Industrial Revolution is starting. Because now you're seeing these poor people of Europe who couldn't get their act together for centuries, all of a sudden getting their act together, figuring out that through these colonies overseas, we can build our empire. So they're dealing with the Oyo. I digress, excuse me. So they're dealing with the Oyo people. The Oyo people now start to say, okay, we fought as many battles with our neighbors here. Let's now go to the west, to what is now called Benin. If you know anything about, let's just take Lagos and Cotonou. Those are the two major cities. Lagos, major city in Nigeria. Cotonou is a major city in Benin. It's literally a 3-hour drive, even now with the bad roads and the borders. 3-hour drive between the two places. So they were, obviously they didn't have cars, but at this point in time, they were like, okay, let's go in this direction. So they go there and they find the Fon people. Fon people, some of them towards Ouida, which if you watch the documentary, it's where I finished the documentary. People along those places are doing deals. They're working with the French, the British, they're working with them. They're the people who are on the periphery of society. They're not necessarily part of the Dahomey kingdom or any other kingdom for that matter. They're just people who do business, who've organized themselves into a society, much like a union, if you will. They realize this is how we can come up by going into the hinterland and taking people. If you read the book Roots, also Alex Haley, fiction or not, it's an accurate story where you have people essentially going in and just stealing whoever they can at this point. Okay, so the Oyo go west. And they go and find these Fon people and they start taking them. And they start loading them up, taking them down to Ouida and then sending them away. Until you find the Fon people around the 1600s, the late 1600s, getting really irritated by this and organize themselves, as all societies do, into a sort of kingdom. A kingdom that is built off the strongest. The strongest of us will survive, okay? So the Amazon, or so-called Mino, or the Agoji, whatever, I don't know what they call it in the actual film, but they have many names. But if you go to Abome, they call them Mino or Agoji. These women are actually a unit that was formed much later by one of the princesses, but no need to discuss that. So they start to go and form themselves into a kingdom. And what do? They move into the hinterland, which is the smart thing to do. If you go to Ghana now, the Ashanti Empire is not based off the coast. You have to go to Kumasi. You have to go into Ghana and then go north. Because to leave yourself on the coast, this isn't like an island where you could just put walls all around it. You can't. You have to go into the hinterland where it's green, where there are trees, where you can hide but protect yourself. So they moved into the hinterland and they go to a place called Abomey. Right now, Abomey, if you go to Cotonou, which is the main city, most flights, it's probably about a 3-4 hour drive to Abomey. They go and establish themselves in Abomey, and of course, it becomes a brutal thing because now they have to defend themselves. But of course, the stronger they get, the more the British and the French and the Portuguese or whoever it is start to realize that, okay, these guys have organized themselves. Let's go make the same deals we did with the Oyo with them. Let's go over and offer them stuff, whether it's trinkets, whether it's weapons, in order to defeat their enemy, the Oyo, who have been kidnapping them for a while and enslaving them. So what they were also doing is what was being done to them. So that's a very important note. On the one hand, somebody is coming and taking these innocent people, villagers, townspeople, some smaller communities, some tribal leaders, and so on, taking these people and enslaving them for the benefits of the Oyo Kingdom and the British Empire. Community into a kingdom, and in order to defend themselves, start doing the same thing to the Oyo. Okay, so we're not thinking about, oh, black on black. We're thinking purely about self-defense of my people. No different to my neighbor. If somebody comes and offers my neighbor all sorts of weapons and tells him to come and enslave me and my family, he might refuse. But if he realizes that the neighbor next to him is about to do the same thing to him, what does he do? He decides, okay, I'm going to do it to him. Regardless of morals, he decides to come and enslave me and my family. And what do? If they make the same deal with me for weapons, I will also do the same thing to him. So we're not thinking about, oh, we're neighbors. We're just thinking in the survival at this point. So the Oyo and the Dahomey get involved in this whole thing. And the Dahomey kingdom really starts to flourish because it becomes so powerful. And like all powerful kingdoms, they are dangerous. And people start to see the sacrificing and so on. And just before we even go there, see, the sacrificing thing is something which you can't excuse. But I think you have to understand the ancient world. You have to understand you have to even, in a way, look at religions that exist now, Christianity and the concept of sacrificing. The Old Testament talks very much about sacrificing lambs. When the Jews, so-called Jews, leave Egypt, whether you believe the story or not, you have to also see the consistencies in sacrifice to the point of even sacrificing the Son of God. Now, I'm not trying to compare them, but it's certainly not the weakest that were being sacrificed. It's the strongest sometimes who would be threats to them. Okay, so you would even have a situation, if you go to Abomey now, there are so many images of kings who were beheaded. Place because there were no prisons. So if the Oyo king is kidnapped, if the Oyo king is loses in battle, rather than enslave him, they might cut his head off, right? So if a ship isn't coming, they might decide, let's cut his head off. And if you go there, there's so many images that are mosaicked into the walls of the palace. So these are things that were happening. I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I think that is for you to, for those, I think the onus is on you to go there and really try and understand it from your own point of view. But anyway, these people, this starts to happen. Now, after a while, it's not just the Dahomey kingdom, but the Ashanti people and all the regions around them start to realize that this thing is really, we're really just playing a game, right? We're being used as part of the game by these Europeans, because really, these people don't know what is going on the other side of the Atlantic. They just know that we have now, people essentially get used to work on the land. So they're not privy to the information. Yes, what was going on down at the coast in the forts was inhumane and degrading and awful. But it's at this point they realize that we're essentially giving off people, and if the demand is high, of course. So sometimes they're giving their own people to an extent, the weakest of their society. Sometimes they realize that we have to stop this thing. And King Gezo, King Agunglo, I've already mentioned, these are some of the people that try to stop it. But it becomes very different because now there's a system in place. And of course, there's no coincidence that when the last ships left Ouida in Benin, probably the last ships to leave West Africa to go to the New World in the late 1800s, within a decade of that, France had conquered Dahomey. So we have to understand the correlation between the system and the colonial system. Because who is entering these places in the first place in order to see the kings, find the roots? It's the missionaries. The missionary system of Europe really started as the enslavement period was also started. So you have women, you have people like Livingston going to East Africa. You have people like Mr. Stanley going into Congo and places like that, and really establishing themselves as missionaries. So they're starting to create these routes. They're starting to figure out, okay, map-wise, this is how you get there. The likes of Richard Burton and so on, who are going and negotiating with the kings of Dahomey and so on, they are looking at the routes and figuring out how to get there. So that when they so-called abolished slavery in the early parts of the 1800s, the British, within 100 years, they have taken over because they have been planning. They had been planning. You see, it's what is it, 220 years now, I think, something like that, 200 and something years since they so-called abolished it. When they decided to do it, it wasn't obviously because they felt bad about it. Of course, there was some pressure from the Quakers and all these other groups, but largely it was because they couldn't keep dealing with the uprisings. And what is the biggest uprising that we all know? Is the Haitian Revolution. Haitian Revolution has a direct correlation with this same region of Dahomey, which essentially you have Minos, the Agoji, if you will, being captured. It's not just them. Sometimes they're put on the ship with people from the Oyo. These are warrior societies. These are people who feel we are fighting. We are fighting. They get, and this is why if you watch my documentary, right at the end, I say, as they are walking on what they call the slave road, and this is something which I advise everybody, if you have a passport, go to Ouida and see these people, as they're being marched side by side. They could have been fighting a war 2 days earlier and just find themselves, I am Dahomey. But we are finding we're looking around, and all we're seeing is that we're just black people. And we're starting to recognize that as the closer we get to the coast, it's just white people. We get on the ship, and it's just white people. We get to the other side of the water, and it's just white people controlling and black people working. They start to quickly see that there is a problem here. And of course, Haitian Revolution, which happens coincidentally, I think no more than 3 years, when it's finally over, no more than 3 years later is the abolishment of slavery by the British. Not a coincidence. I think British abolition is 1807. Haitian Revolution ends around 1804, 1805. So there is no coincidence. But what happens with the Haitian Revolution is very important. Somebody said the sound is going out. I'm so sorry. Okay, can you guys hear me? Just so I know. Just let me know if you can hear me. Just give me a 1, please. Just give me a 1 if you can hear. Very good with these AirPods. Give me a 1 if you can hear, please. Okay, good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, I'll keep this brief because I think my sound's about to completely go. So Haitian Revolution is essentially something, it's essentially a revolution that happens because of uniformity in languages. And just before we even go further, remember at this point in time, as enslaved people are being taken, they're not being, I don't know if this is working. they're not being taken to the Americas straight away. They get taken to, to the United States of America. They get taken to the Caribbean. Remember, Caribbean is the jumping off point. They take them to the Caribbean, and this is at the time when Florida was part of Spain. Then you have the southern, the original states of the colony. Britain owns part of it, and then of course the West still belongs to parts of Mexico and the natives, right? So essentially, the jumping off point is to take them to the Caribbean first. If you look at the currents that take you from West Africa, they take you into the Gulf of Mexico, which is essentially the Caribbean islands. It doesn't take you directly to the United States. So everybody's being taken, and they're not really differentiating the people. They're largely taking people from the similar groups. In the Caribbean, especially, you can see that, because this is why the Haitian Revolution was so prominent and so powerful, because the people there spoke similar languages. They spoke similar languages. They had similar fighting styles. The Mino women that were being taken, these are Goji or so-called Amazons, they fought a certain way. And it's no wonder they were able to sustain a guerrilla warfare for nearly a decade during this Haitian Revolution. And before you even talk about Toussaint Louverture and all these other guys, go before to Mackindal. Mackindal is a man who was essentially, you call him a quote-unquote witch doctor. In other words, he's a practitioner of the Vodun spiritual system, which comes from Dahomey. The Mackindal is one who, before the revolution even or rather gathered pace, he was one of the people who was using the ointments that they made to poison people and so on, poison the enslavement, the slave masters, quote unquote. So this was all happening because people had uniformity in culture, right? And they quickly realized, you want to talk about Pan-Africanism, you want to talk about Black solidarity. The minute they got on the ships and they realized we are all the same color, they get to Haiti and they said, whatever differences we had, this war is bigger than just our beef back home. Let's fight together. And of course, we see so many Prosa, we see so many other examples. And of course, this is after the Haitian Revolution. This is when they decided, okay, we're no longer going to be taking them to the Caribbean first. This is when they decided we're going to ban all the contraband. They can't use their drums anymore. They can't speak their language anymore. And so they now started to differentiate people. So it's why if a quote, I know it's fictional, but a Kunta Kinte is put is brought to what's the name of the place in what is now Maryland, Annapolis, and then taken to and then sold there, and then dispersed to different parts of the United States. This is when this starts to really come, because prior to that, it was all going to the Caribbean. So, in conclusion, the enslavement period in itself, the enslavement that was going on between Dahomey and Oyo was largely fought because people had to supply a certain amount of people to the Europeans that were ultimately playing a con game on them, playing a if you don't go to me, if you don't sell to me, I'll give your neighbors and he can sell me you guys. So they played a very good game, and it was very intelligently done. And they knew that this divide and conquer would work, and it would translate to the so-called slaves on the plantation. Because later on, also, these are also things that are very crucial. I already showed you the correlation between the slavery, Haitian Revolution, and then the abolition of slavery by the British. But also at the same time, we start to quickly see these Quaker groups sending Africans who had been enslaved in America for a century, 200 years, basically, sent back to places like Liberia and Sierra Leone. And you start to see the issues forming, right? The Americans, and this isn't really part of the topic, but I just wanted to just make this note. The Americans recognize we need a foothold still in West Africa, even though we banned slavery. So they send these Europeanized or Americanized African people to essentially start a colony, Liberia. Hence why when you see the Liberian flag, you see the star. It's one star, but it's the American flag, essentially. They named their capital Monrovia after President Monroe. The British do the same thing with Sierra Leone. The French do the same thing at Libreville in Gabon. Everybody is starting to realize that, man, this colonial really care about morality, but really these people, not just these people, but the land that they have is so lucrative for us. So we can do all the other stuff, but we really need to keep getting a foothold. And what they send back is colonized Africans to recolonize the Africans that are there. And this is why you see in Liberia and Sierra Leone in particular the brutal wars that really just ended less than 2 decades ago. The brutal wars that are fought essentially by those Americanized Africans who had been enslaved and the people they were trying to recolonize in the name of the American, British, and French states. It's very important to understand that history doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's not as if these people are all just sitting around and making a decision on behalf of all of them. There are very different peoples who have very different sets of histories, but also it's based off the things that are brought to them. So I'm going to just quickly sum up by saying, again, I haven't seen the Woman King film, and I think it's very important to understand. I'm an African person, and I understand that the Hollywood system is designed to create films for a largely white American audience. So no matter what the film looks like, I am not expecting it to tell my story, whether it's Woman King or Black Panther or Blood Diamond or Last King of Scotland or any of those movies which they've made over the last few years. Hotel Rwanda to be accurate, because they're largely making it to please their audience. So I take it with a pinch of salt. But I think the division that ends up coming about people not wanting to go see it, I think is valid. I think it's because it's sort of, it's almost like it's the hypocrite telling you that no, it's not me that's the problem. It's your own people that are the problem. It's the divide and conquer game that's been played for a long time. Even the fact that the writer is a white woman, I don't expect any more than that. I saw Last King of Scotland. My mother is raised in Uganda, met Idi Amin as a child. Not to say Idi Amin is a saint, but let's be honest. The Last King of Scotland is a completely fictional story. That character, Nicholas Garrigan, is a fictional character, but we are made to believe that that's history. Which other films? Hotel Rwanda. I mean, there's an issue going on with Paul Kagame, the Rwandese president, and the same character who is the lead, who's the savior of these people. And he has been accused of trying to lead some form of a rebellion against Paul Kagame. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter, but we have to see. They sometimes tell it, especially in movies, from a sensationalist point of view. Winston Churchill said, history is going to be kind to Great Britain because I'm going to write the history. And I think that is an important part of understanding the confusion, but also the nuances between us as Africans and African Americans, Africans in the Caribbean. Essentially, we're the same people. My wife could very easily have been kidnapped, forced, taken somewhere else, been enslaved, raped, had children, and her descendants will then look at my descendants as though we are to blame for her capture. It wasn't always that. It's sometimes as simple as that. Certainly, there is no doubt that there are issues where there were kingdoms who were actually enslaving. There's no question. And there were people on the periphery who were actually enslaving purely for profit. But to assume that everyone thought it. Anyway, I wanted to apologize about the sound, guys. Let me just read some of your comments. Oh, where are we? Ekaro, my brother, Bobby E. Wright. Ekaro, sir. Ekaro, Ekushe. You say Ekushe? Ekason, excuse me. Slavery in West Africa. So Miss Blue Love, slavery in West Africa, indentured servitude, where the enslaved worked for a period of time and could marry within or were freed after a certain period of time. American slavery was chattel slavery. Absolutely. Chattel slavery is the 3/5 of a human being slavery. In other words, you are not worth the same as me. I can rape you and have children with you purely for sexual pleasure and to use to work the land, but you're still beneath me. And this is why I will only give you a handful of scriptures to read, if you can. Well, you're not allowed to read, but I'll give you a handful of scriptures to understand, which only talk about you, what the Old Testament discusses about slave, obey your master. Chattel slavery was where people were bought to Miss Blue Love again. chattel slavery was where people were bought, sold, and owned forever, and was very brutal and very inhumane. It was different than slavery in West Africa. Absolutely right. Great conversation. Rokoya. I'm Courtney Michelle. Thank you for this. Slavery in East Africa, slavery in East Africa, Central South. Kalunda. Can you guys hear me still? I hope you can. I am Courtney Michelle. Thank you very much for the $4.99 super chat. Thank you. Thank you. This information, people have been a misconception of history. Your sound goes out at times. Thank you. I will sort it out for the next time, I promise. Global Citizen, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. If you can please add a bibliography and a list of your documentaries so that we can study and teach our children the truth. Absolutely. Subscribe to the channel. All of the documentaries are there. Some of them are off because they're streaming on other platforms, but as of November, a few more will be there. Just to announce again, I'll be going off to Egypt in a couple of weeks. We're shooting an epic documentary about the Nile Valley. We're going essentially from Cairo all the way down to Aswan to really talk about the influences that the Nile Valley had on, or rather, Africa had on the Nile Valley. Because let's not dismiss that Egypt is still in Africa, always has been in Africa, and in fact, Egypt as a society is an African society. But that's not even the main crux of the matter. We look at the linguistics. We look about at what these people wrote about their society too. Liz Z, African involvement in the slave trade is a touchy subject that deserves to be discussed. However painful it is, we need to understand the full picture. Absolutely. And this is why I'm trying to emphasize that you see something going on in the northern part of West Africa, which is largely Islamic. And this is when you start to see the Eastern slave trade. The Eastern slave trade is a different thing. I haven't even dealt with the Eastern slave trade. The Eastern slave trade that goes along the Swahili coast, Tanzania, Kenya, and then goes into across the Indian Ocean into Persia, what is now called that Saudi Arabia, that part of the world. But you can still see remnants of it. And theirs goes back further. You see the Zanj rebellion, there's the rebellion of the Zanj, which took place 1,000 years ago. These were enslaved African people in what is now called Iran-Iraq border, who really tried to fight for their freedom because it was going on there. But it's a very different thing, and I don't really want to start dealing with that now because it's even more complicated. But you can already see the difference in forms of enslavement by outsiders. And in fact, just the last point, if you go to the late 1880s, there was a slaver called Zubair. Zubair was in what is now called Sudan. And of course, he's an Islamic man, but he's a black man. And this is at the time when Egypt is colonizing Sudan. And Egypt in itself, we have to understand, the Ottomans or the Turks came in and colonized Egypt and Northern Africa. All those King of Morocco, these people are remnants of Turks. So they're not even representative of the people of Northern Africa, who are some Arabs, some Berbers, but a lot of black. And you'll see that in the next documentary as well. The further south you go in Northern Africa, Southern Tunisia, Southern Algeria, all these places, you start to see black. But anyway, this guy in Sudan is a black man enslaving black people, but fighting against the Turks who ruled Egypt because he wants Egypt to be under his possession in the name of Islam. And Islam is a completely different, has its own, it needs its own show, which I would deal with at a later date. Last couple of comments. Kwame. Miss Blue Love, Eastern slave trade was very brutal. The Arabs played a part in it. Not just that they played a part in it, they were the central figures in it. They were the central figures in it. Of course, they had collaborators just like us. But if you understand even the proximity between Africa and what is now called the Middle East, remember, Africa is only different to the Middle East because in the late 1800s, again, after Egypt had been colonized essentially by the British, they decided, and Israel, this whole Zionist movement was starting, they decided, let's make a strip of water to separate the two places called the Suez Canal. Literally, it was for ships to be able to, instead of having to go around between Britain
France and all these places, go around the continent. It's so they could just swiftly pass through. It's so narrow. The strip is so narrow, but all it's there for is to allow ships to be able to flow through, go around the Mediterranean, and then get to Britain. That's literally what they made it. Otherwise, you could walk from Egypt into Israel. You could walk from, it's not up until 100 and so years ago. That was how people did it. There wasn't any separation. So even when you talk about the Persians, the Arabs, so-called Arabs, there are certainly white Arabs, but there are also black Arabs. So it's even the concept of Arabs. It's also a very delicate subject to deal with. But yeah, I'm gonna round up now. I'm actually here. I actually did a lot longer than I expected. But thank you all for tuning in. Let me read the last couple of comments. Kwame Olatunji, I recognize you. The main issue for lots of Africans, we do not control our world and we lack knowledge of our history. Africa, and then Liz Z, Africans played a part there too. No one's hands are clean. No one's hands are clean anywhere, okay? But I think context is important. Context is important, especially when we deal with even just the issue at hand now. This, I see a lot about this ADOS, FBA, all these different groups, and I get frustrated when they just level the few. Not all of them do, but when they level the blame at African people and almost relinquish the blame on the Europeans, as though African people started to trade. First of all, we're all the same exact people, and let's just remember, there's a quota to how many people you need on the ship. So when Captain Hawkins and all these different guys have a manifest, they're like, okay, we need so bodies, because when the British came in, they made it about insurance. So you have to guarantee a certain amount of bodies for the insurance to pay out and so on, right? So let's say we need 150. The people capture people in the hinterland, march them down to the coast. They get there, there's 149. What do you think they do? They take the guy who has been who has brought them over. He's captured them. In fact, John Henry Clark had this quote. He said, "Before you accuse other people of being slave traders or selling their people into slavery, check your own lineage, because our own lineage, or your own lineage, could be the person that was the one bringing people off the coast. Remember." There's not one. You speak to 15 black people in anywhere in Brazil, an Afro-Brazilian or an Afro-Caribbean, African-American. Their lineage is split, sometimes with groups that ward each other. Okay, so one way or another, we are all involved in this thing. One way or another, we're all complicit, but also innocent in it. And I think the only way we can solve the problem is by coming together and ensuring that we recognize who the real enemy is. You see, the enemy hasn't changed. The enemy has never changed for 500 years. The enemy hasn't changed for 1,000 years. You go back to ancient Kemet, when they were writing down, when they were trying to unite when they were trying to unite the black people of the region as Kemet to fight against the Amu, the invaders, when they were writing this stuff down, saying to themselves that if you are not careful, these Amu, the white people, will come in and invade us. They're writing this thousands of years before the enslavement of African people. They recognized it in ancient Kemet. We in modern day society still don't recognize what our ancestors wrote. And this is why this documentary we're going to do is so important, because we're going to look at the texts, what these people were writing. And of course, we don't teach each other, we don't teach our children, we ourselves don't learn so-called hieroglyphs or Medunecha. We don't read these languages. These are our languages. But anyway, I'm going to stop there. Miss Blue Love, those groups are toxic. Yep, I agree. Queen Miriam, true, that's right. How can we contribute to your channel? Okay, well, look, guys, thank you. If you notice, I put out about 2 documentaries every year, sorry. Either a 2-part series or just 2 separate documentaries. The point is it's very difficult. I'm doing a lot of it by myself. I'm finding the fixes, financing it largely by myself, some contributions here and there. and then having to go out and shoot it, come back, edit it, and so on. It's very difficult and very tasking. My aim would be to do a lot more frequently. So I would love to ask anybody who watches. Some of you have recognized your names from when I was doing live streams during the pandemic. People who comment and support what we do. I would like to ask you that if you like the content that is on the channel, please not only share it, but I encourage you to as you're sharing it, to encourage people themselves to contribute to the platform. We've put all the different CashApp, PayPal, the GoFundMe, all the links are still there. So please, 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 if you can, contribute to what we do, because and it's not just me. You see, it's there are many other people, but I think what I try to focus on as a filmmaker is the history, but taking a political position as an African, telling our history in the same way Winston Churchill did. Okay, because again, if we look at history, if Germany had won the Second World War, what would Germans say about British people? What would the world be saying about British people? You see, it's all about perspective. So anyway, so please support Cash App, PayPal, all there. I would really appreciate it. I will put the link somewhere, maybe even in the chat. We need to tell our stories, and I encourage anybody else who's also interested, get yourself a passport, go out to West Africa. There are no excuses in 2022, 2023. Go out to West Africa, go and see where your ancestors come from. And even just by walking, you will feel the nuances of being an African. And respect to the people who made the film The Woman King, but until you really step foot in that particular area, it's very difficult for you to understand the mannerisms, the culture, and so on. And all of you come from there, whether you like it or not. You don't come from South Africa where the film was shot, at least not in large numbers anyway. You're West Africans. So I encourage you to go there. Please support us, and thank you. Give me a 1 if you'd like me to do more of these. I'm going to do one more after I see The Woman King. I think it comes out this week. Give me a shout if this is something that interests you. I would be happy to do a few more of these, and also let me know what topics you would like me to cover. I will fix the sound for next time also. But thank you very much. Peace and love, and hope to see you guys all again. God bless. Thank you very much.